Hey everybody, and welcome to Dominion Cards. This is a video series where we take a strategic, in-depth look at various cards from the board game Dominion. Today we're looking at Poacher. This is a 4-cost action from the 2nd edition base game, and it says +1 card, +1 action, +1 coin, discard a card per empty supply pile. Now if you're not 100% sure on what exactly supply pile is referring to, think of this as the set of cards that you are allowed to spend your buys on. So sometimes cards add cards to the table that you're not allowed to buy, and if that pile empties, it doesn't count in this case because it's not a supply pile. It's only a supply pile if you can buy from it. So let's just have a quick overview of Poacher before we get into the details of this. So this is what we call a cantrip coin. Cantrip is +1 card, +1 action, and then it's got an extra coin on top. So we've talked about this effect a lot in our merchant and our market videos. Now we did say in both of those that a card costing 4 was about the right cost for a cantrip coin. And hey, here's Poacher, it's a cantrip coin, and it costs 4. Now, at the start of the game, that's all you're getting, +1 card, +1 action, +1 coin. But as the game progresses, you may start to see supply piles empty. And if that is the case, then Poacher changes and it actually starts discarding cards from your hand. So discarding cards from your hand is usually seen as a negative. Sometimes it's pretty neutral, but a bunch of the time you will have to discard cards that you would otherwise like to play. So if you think about the militia has an attack that is discarding cards from your hand, so if that's seen as an attack, then, it's going to be a bad thing. But it doesn't have to be, right? Discarding cards from your hand can actually be good, and we're going to go into a little bit of that later on. Overall, Poacher is kind of a below-average card. It's not very strong, it's not very exciting, and we'll sort of go into why, but just bear in mind overall that Poacher is generally considered to be not very good. So at the very beginning of the game, when the Poacher is not discarding anything, let's take a look at what that's like. So right at the very, very beginning, before you even played your first turn, you have a deck that generates money at about 0.7 coins per card. So you've got 7 coppers out of 10 cards. The 3 estates don't give you any money, so that's an average of 0.7. So +1 card and +1 coin is sort of like having a card that's giving you 1.7, which is almost like a silver at the start. It's not quite there. Obviously, there's no way to get a turn with 0.7 money. You're going to have variance on either side of that. But in the long term, you would expect that the value of +1 card would go up. So at the very beginning of the game, Poacher, it's almost like silver. It's ever so slightly worse, but in the long term, you might actually prefer to have a cantrip coin rather than a silver in your deck. That is because this cycles through your deck ever so slightly, because it's not a stop card. That means that you run through the cards quicker. It means you get to shuffle sooner, and that means the new cards that you buy you get to see slightly sooner, and you get to play every card in your deck a little bit more often. That tends to make it more powerful. So that's a nice thing that cantrip has over a stop card like silver. And also, if you were to open with Poacher, if you have a 4-3 or a 3-4, what this does by being drawing 1 card instead of being a stop card like silver is that if you picked up your Poacher on turn 3 or 4, as you drew it into your hand on turns 3 or 4, then there is a chance that the other card you opened with could be the 11th or the 12th card and you don't see it, but Poacher helps reduce that chance because it allows you to see the 11th card of your deck on turn 4. So Poacher, even though you make slightly less money on average, it can add a little bit nicer reliability in a different way in stopping your good cards from missing the shuffle right at the beginning of the game. Some cards that you bought on the opening, missing the shuffle and only appearing on turn 5 can sometimes be really, really bad. So Poacher's nice when that's really important. So something like Chapel, for example, if you don't want to miss the Chapel, and it would have been the 11th card, then if you open Poacher alongside it, then you are less likely to have it show up on turn 5. And also if it collides with the Chapel, you can still play the Poacher and find another 4th junk card to trash. Poacher, it's nice in the early game. It's all right as a card. That's all. There's some definite benefits there. Now, discarding a card. As the game goes on, you expect Poacher to start discarding cards. So discarding a card, it really depends on what you're discarding, depends on whether that's bad or not. So if you are discarding an estate, and you weren't going to be able to trash it from your hand this turn, then that's not really a big deal, right? The card, you weren't playing it anyway, so it didn't matter at all. So all your starting cards, the coppers, the estates, those are all very weak, so it's fine to discard them. If you consider that you discard a copper, then the amount of money that you end up playing in total that turn will often be exactly the same than if you just hadn't bought the Poacher, right? You didn't get to play the copper, but the Poacher gave you the coin anyway. Curses are fine to discard because you can't play them, and sometimes you get terminal collision and you can't actually play all of the actions in your hand. So sometimes you find that a Poacher can discard one of those actions you weren't going to play anyway, and then, discard is not so bad. So overall, discarding is less impactful if you have more cards that you don't want to play or can't play. So I've written weak cards here. Note that I am including stuff like Provinces in that, because while Province is a very good card for the end of the game, you can't actually play it from your hand, and so as far as playing your turns go, it's a pretty weak and poor card, right? It's unplayable card, basically. So at the very beginning of the game and at the very end of the game, you tend to have cards in your deck that you don't mind discarding. So discarding cards is nice then. The big problem is that in the middle of the game, if you've trashed all of your starting cards and you've bought a load of good cards that you want to play, discarding can be quite bad then, because you actually want to play every card that you draw, and when you discard from hand, sometimes that stops you from being able to do that. Now, Poacher, of course, doesn't actually discard right at the very start of the game, but it might discard later. So if you get a Poacher and eventually it ends up discarding exactly one card each time, that's not really that bad. If that can stop you from playing a card that you otherwise wanted to, but if you consider that the Poacher had been a silver instead, sometimes having a stop card like silver will actually stop you being able to draw your whole deck. And so discarding one card when you play a Poacher isn't necessarily going to be any worse than having a stop card in your deck instead. Both of them can prevent you from playing cards, or require you to draw more cards to play everything. So it's not necessarily that much different, but the Poacher being a card that draws is nicer because it allows you to more easily find like the villages and the smithies that you need to keep going. Now, if Poacher ends up discarding 2 or more cards, then usually that's quite bad. Getting just 1 coin for 2 discards, it's very rare that that's actually a good thing. So, you've got to watch out for that, and you've got to consider that when you're getting Poacher. So we need to talk about this. How do you know how many piles are going to empty and what Poacher's going to be like during the game? Because you kind of have to try and figure this out before you actually start adding Poachers to your deck. So you've got to think about this right at the start of the game before any turns have been played, if Poacher's available and you're thinking of getting it. Now, how soon piles empty is actually something that all players contribute to. So sometimes it can depend a lot on what strategy your opponent picks. So it can actually be very difficult sometimes to understand what cards are going to empty. But usually you have some idea of which cards you want many copies of. So you usually know that like Chapel is definitely not going to empty very quickly. But if you've got one village and a lot of good terminals, including like Terminal Draw and strong payload cards, then you can expect that villages are probably going to empty pretty quickly as well. So, it sort of depends. If there's like Merchant and there's a lot of buys and it looks like a deck that's easy to draw a lot of cards, then you might consider that Merchant will probably empty as well. These are the sorts of things that you need to think about. Like generally, if the card is what I call a spammable card, that usually means it's like a cantrip, or if, for example, Laboratory is your only draw, or maybe it's a Festival Library Kingdom, in which case festivals are probably going to run. Like usually you think about the deck you want to build and you want to say, do I want as many as possible, ideally, of this one type of card? Then if you do, then that's probably going to empty, and that means that Poacher is probably going to be discarding at some point. Another pile you need to watch out for is the curse pile. If there's any junker attacks, then the curse pile is probably going to empty as well, but do bear in mind that curses are usually fine to discard because you can't play them anyway. So even if the curses do empty and now you've got like 2 poachers and they start discarding cards, if they're discarding curses, then it doesn't really matter a lot of the time unless you were hoping to trash them from your hand. And of course, sometimes discarding is a good thing and you actually want it to happen pretty quickly. So it's hard to give more specific advice than this because it's so border dependent. But as you start to get better at the game and you start to realise what sort of good decks look like and you start to get a better idea of what sort of plans you think you might realistically be able to have on a board, then you start to be able to make this judgment call a lot more easily. Now, how many poachers do you want? So this looks at first glance like a spammable card, right? It's a cantrip coin. You can play as many of them as you like, and usually in the case of like Merchant or Market, that means it's easy to just add them into your deck and just support them. But this isn't really the case with Poacher, and that is because of its discard from your hand means that you can't really support a lot of discarding from your hand a lot of the time. It really does make it hard to do good things with your turn. So that doesn't mean that you can't get any poachers. Getting 1, 2, or 3 is often absolutely fine in a 2-player game. Bear in mind when you get more than 2 players, piles are actually more likely to run more quickly because you have more people aiming to pick up cards from those piles. So do watch out for that and do consider that. It means that you might not be able to support as many poachers as you would in 2-player. If you get too many poachers, you will end up discarding quite a lot of cards, and it's usually the case that at least one pile is going to empty in most games. So if you consider Poacher, when you're thinking about it, to think like most of the time this is actually going to be discarding a card, then that can be like a nice mental shortcut in terms of just thinking more quickly at the start of the game about what Poacher's going to be like. If you get too many poachers, then you leave yourself open for your opponent to recognise this and deliberately empty a pile to try and make your deck worse. If you get a lot of poachers, and I'm talking like 7 or 8, then the poacher pile itself becomes one that your opponent can pick up. And if you have more poachers than your opponent, even though they've just bought some poachers, your deck could be considered slightly worse because you have way more cards that is going to discard from your hand that you might not be able to play very easily. Poacher in general, if discarding is bad and you don't want piles to run, then bear in mind that any cards that give you plus buys or gain cards directly, like Workshop, can make it much easier to empty a pile, and therefore Poacher gets worse in those sorts of situations. Of course, this only really tends to apply to cards where you want a lot of action cards or kingdom cards. Silver and gold, very hard for those piles to empty. So when I talk about buys and gains, I mean if you want to buy and gain cards that aren't silver and gold generally, if it's only silver and gold that you're gaining, then odds are that piles are not going to empty at all. And if you can only gain 1 card per turn, then you can still find a pile empty, but it's actually a lot harder to achieve that. So bear that in mind when you're looking at Poacher. Now, I've talked before in Market and Merchant videos about something called a cantrip kingdom, so usually merchants, markets, and sentries, and other cards from other expansions. Like, you can make a deck that draws itself every turn if those are the only cards. So you can't increase your hand size, but you can still just play a lot of cards. Poacher is kind of risky to add to those decks. If you consider that you have a 5-card hand and all you want to be playing are cantrips, then you can support at most 4 stop cards and still be guaranteed to draw your deck every turn. And and it's okay if Poacher discards one of those stop cards, but you are actually making it slightly more difficult to draw everything. So if you do want to play all of your cantrips, bear in mind that if you discard one of those stop cards, you will actually have to draw it again at the end of your turn. Otherwise, you can end up reaching the end of your shuffle with like 3 or more cantrips still in your hand that you don't want to risk playing. So this is why Poacher can get quite risky in a cantrip kingdom. It makes it harder to actually support the other cantrips, because when you have a smaller hand size, you just can't support that many stop cards, and cantrip kingdoms care a lot about the number of stop cards that are in their deck. So it's not normally considered when people are looking at cantrip kingdoms, but like having just one in there is usually okay. Like, it's not going to be the end of the world. It's probably going to be better than adding in a silver, at least a bunch of the time, into those sorts of decks. So we've talked a lot about discarding in terms of it being a negative, but sometimes discarding can actually be positive for you. Now, there are a lot of cards out there that have discard effects from your hand. I don't really want to go too much into depth about when the discard is good in every single video where I talk about a card that can discard from your hand, because we'll just be going over the same thing over and over again. So what I'd actually like to do is save the explanations for the cards that we talk about in general that benefit from discard. So if you've seen my Sentry video, you will know where I talked about how you can discard curses from your hand, and then the Sentry might be able to trash them if you can draw your deck, because you guarantee that it's drawn at the end, so you kind of know when it's going to show up. So Sentry is an example of a card where the discarding can be good. Poacher can help you clean up all your curses using Sentry, because you can discard the curses from your hand. Similarly, you have cards like Draw, which we call Draw to X. So Library in the base game is one of those, and that's where you draw until you have a certain number of cards in your hand. These cards really don't like victory cards and other stop cards like silvers and treasures, and Poacher allows you to discard those cards, which means that when you next play a library, it will draw more, and you get further through your deck. So that can be a case where you actually really do want some Poachers just to make it a little bit easier and more reliable to get through your deck. And of course, there are cards like Tunnel and Village Green that literally have written on them benefits that you get if you discard those cards specifically. So again, that's a video for another time for those. This is not an exhaustive list, but just bear in mind that there can be times when Poachers discard is actually not a negative. So you can't think of it always in terms of being like a purely bad thing if it starts discarding cards. So, one of the last thing that we need to talk about here, one of the biggest problems, however, that Poacher has as a card is opportunity cost. So if you think that Poacher at the very beginning of the game is not discarding any cards, you might think that Poacher would be a really good card to pick up early. But the reality is that there's a lot of cards that cost 4 that are really nice early on. So the base game, just even if we just consider the base game on its own, Militia and Moneylender are 2 examples of cards that are way better to open with that cost 4. So Poacher often doesn't really get a look in right at the start of the game, even though theoretically that's when it's at its best. That's because its best is still not as good as many other 4-cost cards. Now, a card that came out before Poacher, even though it's from the Hinterlands expansion, is Oasis. That's because Poacher's a 2nd edition card. So it gets compared a lot to Oasis. Now, Oasis is, as you can see, +1 card, +1 action, +1 coin. Discard a card. So it's kind of like Poacher once one pile is emptied, but Oasis is generally considered a better card than Poacher. And the reason why is because it only costs 3 instead of 4. That means you can actually open it alongside something like Militia or Moneylender that you can't do with Poacher. So the cost difference between 4 and 3 usually isn't all that impactful, but in this particular case, in the case of Poacher, it actually really does matter. And Poacher is a worse card because it costs 4 rather than 3. So that's why Poacher is not very strong and is below average. It's not a bad card per se, but it's just a card that you can't really add that many of, and a cantrip coin where you're only allowed to get like 1 or 2 of them is not very exciting overall. It's fine for its effect, but it's never going to be some like core fundamental part of your deck. You just get it alongside other cards, and it adds an effect, and it's a nice effect. But it's a small impact card, I guess. It's not bad, but it's not great either. So what we're going to do now is we are going to just transfer over to the online client, and we are going to generate some random kingdoms involving Poacher, and we're just going to assess how good it is and how many of them you're going to want. So what's going on this board? So we can clean our deck with Sentry. We have Village, but the only draw is either Moat or Library. And there's no plus buy, but there is Artisan. So what's happening on this board here? You can kind of get an engine going with Village and Moat, but it's never going to be all that strong. You would like to have golds. You've got Remodel as a quite nice payload here. Artisan really not very exciting just because there aren't that many good cards. I guess you're fine. If you get it, you want it for some sentries probably. But you would only ever be picking up like villages and moats, and I don't see that as being very good for Artisan. So I think you still want to trash a bit with Sentry, but otherwise you are looking to actually just purchase some golds, and then at the end of the game you will try to do some remodeling stuff. So Poacher's actually okay here. Again, you don't want too many, but it's actually quite hard to empty piles. So I think you can easily get away with 3 Poachers, or could you risk a 4th? Probably. I think Poacher's better than Silver here, and you will get it, and you will try and pick up some villages and some moats. I think if you do hit 6, actually you do get Artisan, because it's nice to pick up like duchies in the late game. But what you're really looking to do is you would rather skip Silver entirely, and if you can, I guess you buy 1 at the start of the game. You would open Poacher Silver, or would you go for the remodel? Because you could remodel the estates, but maybe you'd rather just trash the estates of Sentry. I think you open like Silver Poacher. You look to get an Artisan. You will pick up some villages, moats to try and draw, and otherwise you're going to try and just get most of your money from a small number of Poachers, some golds, and eventually you get a remodel and you try and gain a few more provinces, and then you start picking up duchies with Artisan. It's not super strong. I don't know if you can really support Library all that well. It's better if you're playing a remodel to get a smaller hand size and then a Library. Maybe you can pick up 1, but I think Moat Village is just going to be more consistent form of draw, but maybe you can get 1 Library. Mine is... It's not that great. I don't think this board is quite bad enough for mine. I don't think it's quite able. But it is nice if you can get some extra golds out of it, because you can remodel those. So maybe mine even does have a place. But to focus back on Poacher, I think you can actually get a number of Poachers here. They're quite good. And it's just harder to empty these piles pretty easily. So Poacher's quite nice there. But generally the board overall is a little bit weak as far as engines go, but it's okay. So what's going on this one? We got good 5s with Sentry and Witch, and there's a Militia attack, so you really want to open Militia first. And you want to open it with a Silver, and you're looking to get Sentries and Witches. In terms of how you're going to draw in this game, you have Throne Room as a village, and you can have merchants, and that's sort of your village, Throne Room and merchant, and you've got Smithy to draw, which is going to be better than Library. Again, you're okay with some Poachers here, but you're going to have some Silvers. If you can keep clean, you're happy to build the engine, but bear in mind, I say Smithy, but the Witch is probably better, isn't it? You're going to have Witches. I guess the problem here is that there's no plus buy. So how good is the engine anyway? You kind of want sentries to keep clean in general, and you can have a consistent drawing engine, but you might still get some bandit anyway once the curses run out, because the golds, you can't actually gain the merchants that easily. I guess you don't really want too many throne rooms, but you're going to want some. So the militia attack is just very good. Does that make Library better, thinking about it, if you've got a militia attack? I think you can support 1 Library, but you're going to have draw with Witch, regardless, and you are going to want a bunch of merchants. Can these piles actually run out? I think, actually, it might be better if a pile does look to run out, you're happy to go library with Poacher, because you might get militia attacked, and you've got Poacher for some discards, and you can find a library and draw up pretty well. But you only want to build so much anyway, and it's hard because you need quite a number of cards in order to get your village, and the throne room and like the merchant, you've just got to spend 2 turns to get cards like this. So it's really slow to build a deck that can do very much. But I think that you can't really go witch money because of the fact that militia, if you can play the militia every turn, anyone who tries not to build the engine gets crushed. So I think, again, Poacher is actually quite nice here because you have the ability to support library, and your sentries, your poachers, your merchants, you want some of these so that your throne room can act like a village, and then that's quite nice. But I think this is a weird board where you're going for a card like library, but actually you want treasures and like bandit to gain golds as well. So that's kind of a bit weird. Yeah, and I guess if you have a bandit, merchant can sometimes get its silver destroyed as well. So a bit of a weird board, that one. But I think Poacher is, again, that's a card that you're not going to open with it, but you will have some of them. And how many you end up having is going to depend on how good a library becomes, how quickly a pile actually does empty. Curses will empty, it's worth noting that. Okay, enough about that one. Let's talk about this one. We've got Chapel and Sentry for trashing. That's real nice. We got Throne Room as a village. So we're not ever really going to have many cards that we want to discard. Again, there's no buys and there's no form of extra gains except remodel. I think this is a kingdom where you want a high action density and you're going to try using Vassal because you've got Throne Room and you've got Sentry. Poacher is probably okay here just because I can't actually see any pile emptying. It's really hard to empty piles here. So Poacher's just quite nice overall. But if you get too many, then Poacher becomes the risk of emptying. So I think, because you're going to buy 1 card at a time, you're going to trash down, you're going to use Poachers as your initial money to start getting some vassals and throne rooms. So you open like Chapel Poacher, and you can have Poacher, it helps you get to vassal, and then you can buy throne rooms, and your deck builds up from there. Eventually, maybe you pick up 1 remodel, but you're going to try and generate your money through vassals and Poachers. But if you get too many of either of those, then you don't actually want that many because you run the risk of your deck then becoming quite bad. Like if the Poachers discard here, that can be a real problem for you. So I guess that's how this deck's going to go. So we're generating a lot of boards here where Poacher's actually quite nice. I sort of wasn't expecting it to turn out this way. Let's see what we've got. So our draw here is Laboratory, Library, Market. We have no trashing, but we do have Witch. The only trashing is Remodel, which is real bad with Witch. So Witch is super dominant here. The only village is Throne Room, and that's probably okay just because we can get a lot of labs. There is buys with Market here, but there's no super cheap card you want a lot of, maybe Throne Rooms. And you have got Artisan to get you a lot of laboratories and markets. Okay, so we have got a reasonable engine here, but it's really, really important that we get as many curses as possible into our opponent's deck as soon as we can. Poacher is fine to open with. Maybe, no, I don't think you open Remodel necessarily. I think you go Silver Poacher to maximise the chance of getting to 5 and using Witch. And then once you got your first one, you can pick up a Remodel and look to turn the estates into Throne Rooms or more Poachers. You want to hit 6, get Artisan, get as many labs as you can. At that point, curses and labs will be empty, and I see that happening. And then the Poachers are not actually super great, even though you're going to have a bunch of curses. So I think you can support like 1 or 2 Poachers here. but you don't really want that many more. You are more happy to take markets with Artisan, and throne rooms are nicer than Poacher because they can throne the labs and the markets, and that's just way better value for a 4-cost card. So Poacher, you open with it here on a 4-3, but you don't really want that many. You can't actually deal with discarding a lot of cards, and piles are going to empty because there's some nice gainers, and the curse pile's going to run. So yeah, so Poacher, limited use, but there's nothing really better to open with. And what have we got here? So we've got Chapel for trashing. There is no village at all, but there is Artisan. But is Artisan even that good? Well, if we trash down with Chapel, what are we actually going to do? So we're going to get... the only buy is Council Room. The only other gain is like Artisan. So I think we trash down, we open Chapel and Poacher. We don't care to hit 5 that early, but we will have some silvers. I say I want to get a bandit and get a lot of golds here, so maybe the merchants aren't that good. I think, again, we can support Poachers here because we can't actually empty piles. It's going to be hard to empty piles, like Artisan isn't going to want to do it. The only pile that's probably going to run would be like Duchy, and it's okay if Duchy runs because you're going to have a bunch of Duchies for Poacher to discard. So I think we want to start with Chapel. And eventually the other card that we will be playing as our terminal every term is going to be a bandit. Artisan, maybe Artisan just isn't very good here. I think I would prefer bandit and just get a high density of golds and try and destroy my opponent's golds and then get to province. And I think merchant is kind of at risk of not working because you're going to want to play a whole load of bandits and trash their silvers. So I think Poacher, again, works fine here just because the supply piles are really going to struggle to empty. In fact, it may be the case that no supply pile empties at all, in which case Poacher is nice. But again, you can't get... Well, I was going to say you can't get too many of them, but that's not really going to happen anyway because it's so hard to actually empty piles. And you just want to pick up 1 province per turn. I don't think you play Council Room. I think you just have Bandit is the card that you just want to play a lot of here. Yeah. So there was 5 kingdoms. Poacher was actually useful in all of them. Some of these boards, I think, were particularly nice for Poacher, actually, interestingly. I would say overall that maybe Poacher isn't going to look quite as good when you do things like this, when in general, like base-only kingdoms. But you can see here that the thinking about how the game's going to go and how quickly piles empty is quite important. Now, bear in mind, all this analysis was done as 2-player. If some of these kingdoms, like this one, was done as a 3-player or 4-player, then it's actually quite different because there's going to be so many bandit plays that actually it's going to be hard to have any money. And maybe Poacher's just a little bit better. This board seems... Would you actually get a moat just to stop the bandit attacks in like 3 or 4-player? Probably not. No. Yeah, this is a tricky one, this, actually, with more players. But anyway, yeah, so that was Poacher. I hope that was interesting for you. It benefits a lot from trying to have a good high-level overview of how the game is going to go. That's sort of the main thing that Poachers will just sort of... Your ability to play it well will just get better as your ability to assess the game gets better. There's not too much to think necessarily about it otherwise. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.